The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road that led to nowhere, and Clara Hayes walked it like a woman carrying the weight of the world in her arms. The baby, little Emma, barely 2 years old, had stopped crying hours ago, which worried Clara more than the tears ever had. Children should cry when they're hungry, thirsty, scared. Silent children were children who'd given up hope. Clara's worn boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each weary step. Her dress, once a cheerful blue cotton, now bore the stains and tears of 3 weeks on the road. 3 weeks since she'd fled Denver with nothing but the clothes on her back and her daughter clutched to her chest. 3 weeks of walking, begging rides from sympathetic travelers, sleeping in barns when she was lucky, under stars when she wasn't. The baby's weight seemed to increase with each mile, though Emma had actually grown lighter, too light. Her chubby cheeks had hollowed, her bright eyes had dulled, and she no longer reached for the wildflowers they passed or babbled her sweet nonsense words. She just lay against Clara's shoulder, trusting and patient in the way only children can be, even as their world crumbles around them. In the distance, Clara spotted a ranch house, weathered wood and stone but solid-looking. Corrals and outbuildings spoke of prosperity, or at least stability. Cattle dotted the surrounding grassland like dark patches on a green quilt. It looked like the kind of place where people might spare a cup of milk for a hungry child, maybe even a meal for a desperate mother. Clara's pride had died somewhere between Denver and here, beaten to death by necessity and a mother's fierce love. She would beg if she had to. She would grovel. She would do whatever it took to keep Emma alive, because that's what mothers do. They endure the unendurable for their children. As she approached the ranch's wooden gate, she noticed a man sitting on the front porch whittling. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years under the prairie sun. He looked up as she approached, his knife stilling in his hands, and Clara saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in too long. Not judgment, not suspicion, just quiet assessment. "Ma'am," he said simply, rising from his chair. His voice was deep, gravelly from disuse, but not unkind. Clara stopped at the gate, swaying slightly on her feet. Up close, the rancher was even more imposing, probably 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands that spoke of honest work. His face was deeply tanned, lined around the eyes from squinting against the sun, and his dark hair was touched with early silver at the temples. "Please," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter. She needs milk, food. I can work for it. I can clean, cook, mend, whatever you need. Just please, she's so little." The rancher's eyes moved from Clara's face to the bundle in her arms, and something shifted in his expression. Emma chose that moment to lift her head and look at the stranger with those enormous blue eyes that had always been her most striking feature. Even now, dulled by hunger and exhaustion, they were beautiful. "How long since she's eaten?" he asked, moving toward the gate. "Yesterday morning. A farmer's wife gave us some bread and jam, but—" Clara's voice broke. "I have nothing left to give her. Nothing." The rancher opened the gate without hesitation. "Come inside. My name's Daniel Morrison. This is the Double M Ranch." Clara followed him toward the house, noting the care with which everything was maintained, despite the obvious absence of a woman's touch. The porch was swept clean, the windows clear, but there were no curtains, no flowers, no softening touches that spoke of feminine influence. "I'm Clara Hayes," she managed. "This is Emma." Daniel held the door open for her, and Clara stepped into a kitchen that was clean but sparse, functional rather than welcoming. A large table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by simple wooden chairs. Cast iron pots hung from hooks near a massive stone fireplace, and shelves lined the walls, holding dishes and supplies in neat bachelor order. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing toward a chair. "Let me get some milk." He moved to a pantry and returned with a ceramic pitcher and a small cup. As he poured, Clara noticed his hands, large and calloused but surprisingly gentle. He handed her the cup, and she immediately brought it to Emma's lips. The little girl drank eagerly, milk running down her chin, and the relief in Clara's chest was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Daniel watched them for a moment, then spoke words that would change everything. "Your baby needs milk, and my ranch needs a mother." Clara's hand stilled on the cup, milk still dripping from Emma's eager lips. She looked up at Daniel Morrison with a mixture of hope and wariness. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. and their expectations weren't always ones a decent woman could fulfill. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morrison?" she asked carefully. Daniel pulled out a chair across from her and sat down heavily, as if the words he was about to speak carried physical weight. "This ranch runs about 500 head of cattle plus horses. It's good land, profitable when managed right. But it's lonely work and it's incomplete work." He gestured around the sparse kitchen. "I can cook beans and bacon, mend tack, birth calves, and balance books. But I can't make a house into a home. Can't provide the kind of stability a child needs, the gentleness a baby requires." His eyes met hers directly. "And you can't provide food and shelter and safety for your daughter on your own, not out here." Emma had finished the milk and was looking around the room with more alertness than Clara had seen in days. The child seemed to sense they'd found sanctuary, at least temporarily. "You're suggesting a marriage of convenience," Clara said quietly. "I'm suggesting a partnership," Daniel corrected. "You'd have a home, security, a father for your daughter. The ranch would have a woman's touch, proper meals, someone to tend the house while I tend the land. It's not romance, Mrs. Hayes. It's survival, plain and simple." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motive. Instead, she saw a practical man facing a practical problem with a practical solution. There was no passion in his voice, no false promises of love or happiness. Just honest need meeting honest need. "You don't know anything about me," she pointed out. "I could be running from the law, from a husband, from debts. I could be a terrible cook or a lazy housekeeper." "Could be," Daniel agreed. "But your daughter's clean despite your circumstances, well-behaved despite being hungry. You've kept her safe and loved through whatever brought you here. That tells me what kind of woman you are." Emma began to fuss, reaching for her mother, and Clara automatically shifted the child to her hip, bouncing her gently. "And what kind of man are you, Mr. Morrison?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands as if they held answers to questions Clara hadn't asked. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I'm a man who spent 15 years building something worth having and nobody to share it with. I'm 40 years old, never been married because I never found a woman willing to love the isolation as much as she loved me." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm honest to a fault, sometimes cruel in my practicality, and I work from dawn to dusk because it's all I know how to do." Emma had grown heavy in Clara's arms, and without being asked, Daniel rose and retrieved a folded blanket from a chest near the window. He spread it on the floor in a patch of afternoon sunlight, creating a makeshift bed for the tired child. "I don't drink to excess," he continued as Clara settled Emma on the blanket. "Don't gamble, don't frequent saloons or sporting houses. I attend church when weather permits, pay my debts, and treat my workers fairly." He paused. "I also have a temper when crossed, little patience for dishonesty, and I expect people to carry their own weight." Clara watched Emma curl up on the blanket, one small thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit Clara had been trying to break, but which now seemed like the most precious thing in the world. Her daughter was safe, fed, warm. For the moment, that was enough. "Your turn," Daniel said quietly. Clara took a shaky breath. The truth was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in weeks. But something about this man's straightforward honesty demanded the same in return. "I was married to a man named Richard Hayes. He was charming, educated, well-dressed, everything a young woman thinks she wants in a husband." Her voice grew bitter. "He was also a gambler, a drinker, and eventually a thief. When his debts caught up with him in Denver, he disappeared in the night, leaving Emma and me to face his creditors." Daniel's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the table's edge. "I worked as a seamstress to support us, but it wasn't enough to pay what he owed. When his associates began making threats involving Emma's safety, I took what little we had and ran." She looked down at her sleeping daughter. "We've been walking for 3 weeks. I have no money, no family, nowhere else to go." "The baby's father?" Daniel asked quietly. "Emma's mine," Clara said firmly. "Whatever arrangement we make, that doesn't change. She's my daughter, my responsibility, my heart." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then she'd be mine too if you stayed." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Emma slept peacefully on her makeshift bed, her breathing even and calm for the first time in weeks. The kitchen was filled with the golden light of late afternoon, and somewhere outside, cattle lowed softly as they moved toward evening pastures. Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten, the possibility of rest. Not just physical rest, though her body ached for that, but the deeper rest that came from knowing you didn't have to face tomorrow alone. The weight of constant vigilance of being the only thing standing between your child and disaster was a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "What would you expect from me?" she asked quietly. "As your wife." Daniel's face colored slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I'd expect you to keep house, cook meals, tend Emma, help with the ranch work when needed. In return, you'd have a home, protection, everything Emma needs to grow up healthy and safe." "And at night?" Clara asked, though the words cost her. "Separate rooms until we decide otherwise," Daniel said immediately. "If we decide otherwise." This arrangement would be about partnership, not other things. Not unless we both wanted it. The relief in Clara's chest was so profound she had to close her eyes for a moment. She'd been prepared for worse, much worse. The idea that she could have security without surrendering her body to a stranger seemed almost too good to be true. "There'd need to be an understanding," she said finally, "about Emma. She's been through enough upheaval. Whatever arrangement we make, she needs stability, consistency. She needs to feel safe. She'd have her own room," Daniel said. "I could add on to the house if needed. And she'd never want for anything: food, clothes, education, affection. A child deserves all of that." Clara looked around the kitchen again, seeing it now not as a stranger's space but as a potential home. She could picture curtains at the windows, flowers in a vase on the table, Emma's laughter echoing off the walls. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life, a chance to build something good from the ashes of everything she'd lost. "How do we make this official?" she asked. Daniel rose and extended his hand across the table. "We shake on it now, travel to town tomorrow for the legal ceremony. Pastor Williams can marry us and Judge Henderson can make the adoption papers official." Clara stared at his outstretched hand, work roughened, honest, steady. Then she reached out and clasped it in her own. "Partners," she said. "Partners," he agreed. As evening settled over the Double M Ranch, Daniel showed Clara to what would be her room, a small but comfortable space adjacent to the kitchen, with a window overlooking the vegetable garden he'd been neglecting, and a connecting door to an even smaller room that would be perfect for Emma. "I'll bring in a proper crib tomorrow," he said, watching as Clara settled Emma on the narrow bed with rolled blankets as barriers. "And we'll need to get supplies in town. Clothes for both of you, proper food, whatever else you need." Clara ran her hand over the clean quilt, noting the precise stitching and sturdy construction. Everything in Daniel's house spoke of quality built to last, including the man himself. "You made this?" "My mother did. She died when I was 16, before I had sense enough to learn her domestic skills." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, careful not to intrude on the intimate scene of mother tucking child into bed. "I've been making do with basic necessities ever since." Emma was exhausted from the day's excitement and her first full belly in weeks. She curled up with the rag doll that was her only remaining toy, a pitiful thing Clara had sewn from fabric scraps, but which Emma treasured above all else. "Mama," Emma whispered, the first word she'd spoken all day. "Home?" Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, baby. This is home now." Daniel disappeared quietly, returning a few minutes later with a basin of warm water, clean towels, and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. "Thought you might want to wash up," he said, setting everything on the small table near the window. It was such a simple kindness, but after weeks of cold streams and borrowed facilities, the prospect of warm, clean water brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll be on the porch if you need anything," Daniel said. "Kitchen's yours whenever you're ready to explore. Make yourself at home, Clara. That's what this is now." After he left, Clara undressed Emma and gave her a proper bath for the first time in weeks, washing the dust and grime from her soft skin and tangled curls. Emma giggled at the warm water, a sound so sweet Clara had to pause and just listen to it. When had she last heard her daughter laugh? Then Clara bathed herself, marveling at the luxury of privacy and cleanliness. As she braided her damp hair, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman looking back. Clara woke to the sound of voices outside her window, and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment she was disoriented. The bed was too comfortable, the room too quiet, the sense of safety too foreign. Then memory returned. The ranch, Daniel Morrison, the handshake agreement that had changed everything. Emma was still sleeping, curled up with her rag doll, breathing peacefully. Clara dressed quickly in her spare dress, the better of her 2 remaining garments, and crept into the kitchen to find Daniel at the table with 2 other men, all of them holding steaming cups of coffee. "Clara," Daniel rose immediately, "I'd like you to meet my foreman Jim Parker and my ranch hand Miguel Santos. Boys, this is Clara Hayes, my fiancée." The word sounded strange in his mouth, but Clara appreciated that he'd chosen it over arrangement or convenience. Jim Parker was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. Miguel Santos was younger, perhaps 25, with the easy grace of someone born to ranch work. "Ma'am," Jim said, tipping his hat. "Mighty pleased to meet you. Been telling Dan here for years he needed a woman's touch around this place." Miguel grinned. "Si, señora. And perhaps now we get better food than beans and bacon every meal, no?" Clara felt her cheeks warm at their easy acceptance. "I'll certainly do my best to improve the cooking situation." "Don't mind them," Daniel said, shooting his men a look that was half warning, half affection. "They're good workers, but terrible gossips. Speaking of which," Jim said, "word's already spread that you came to town yesterday for supplies and a marriage license. Mrs. Patterson from the general store was mighty curious about your bride-to-be." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "What did you tell her?" "That it wasn't any of our business, but that you seemed happier than we'd seen you in years," Miguel said loyally. Which is true, by the way. Emma's cry from the bedroom interrupted the conversation, and Clara excused herself to tend to her daughter. When she returned carrying the sleepy toddler, she found the men had cleared their coffee cups and were preparing to leave for morning chores. "Beautiful little girl," Jim said softly, and Clara saw genuine warmth in his eyes. "She'll love it here. Ranch is a good place for children to grow up." After the men left, Daniel poured Clara coffee and set out the bread and jam he'd purchased in town. Emma sat on Clara's lap, contentedly gnawing on a piece of bread while studying Daniel with curious eyes. "They seem like good men," Clara observed. "The best," Daniel agreed. "Jim's been with me since I started this place. Miguel's been here 3 years. They're family, really." 3 days later, Clara stood in front of Pastor Williams in the small Cedar Ridge Community Church, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson from the general store had insisted was perfect for a ranch wedding. Daniel had arranged everything with quiet efficiency. The ceremony, witnesses, even a small celebration lunch at the town's only restaurant. Emma sat in the front pew between Jim and Miguel, both men having taken to their new role as surrogate uncles with surprising enthusiasm. The little girl was clean and pretty in a new yellow dress, her curls freshly washed and tied with ribbons. She clapped her hands when Clara and Daniel exchanged vows, as if she understood the significance of the moment. "Do you, Daniel Morrison, take Clara Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Daniel said firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "And do you, Clara Hayes, take Daniel Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" Clara looked into Daniel's steady brown eyes and saw not passion or romance, but something perhaps more valuable: reliability, honesty, commitment to the promises he made. "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." It was a chaste kiss, barely more than a brush of lips, but it sealed their partnership officially and completely. Emma squealed with delight and clapped her hands, making the sparse congregation chuckle. Judge Henderson handled the adoption papers with equal efficiency. "Emma Morrison," he said, signing the documents with a flourish. "That has a nice ring to it." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks as she realized her daughter now had legal protection, a father who would ensure her welfare, and a name that would shield her from the circumstances of her birth. After the ceremony, the small wedding party gathered at Morrison's restaurant for a celebration lunch. Daniel had ordered a cake, nothing elaborate but sweet and special enough to mark the occasion. Emma got frosting in her hair and on her dress, but nobody minded. "To new beginnings," Jim toasted, raising his glass of lemonade. "And to family." "To family," Clara repeated, looking around the table at these people who had welcomed her and Emma without question or judgment. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both new and natural. Clara rose early to prepare breakfast for Daniel and the ranch hands, finding satisfaction in cooking for people who appreciated good food after years of bachelor fare. Daniel had been right about his limitations. He could make beans and bacon edible, but Clara could make them delicious. Emma thrived in the ranch environment. She followed Jim around like a devoted puppy, learning the names of animals and tools with the quick absorption of childhood. Miguel taught her Spanish words, which she repeated with solemn concentration. And with Daniel, she developed a special bond. He would carry her on his shoulders during evening walks, show her how to pet the gentler horses, and listen with grave attention to her increasingly complex chatter. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger," Clara observed one evening, watching Daniel read Emma a bedtime story with infinite patience despite his exhaustion from a long day. "Smart girl," Daniel replied, not looking up from the picture book. "Knows a good deal when she sees one." Clara had transformed the house gradually, adding feminine touches without overwhelming Daniel's masculine space. Curtains in the windows, flowers from the neglected garden, quilts and pillows that made the rooms feel warmer. She'd also established an organized system for household supplies, mended Daniel's extensive collection of damaged clothing, and began planning a more substantial garden for next year. But it was the small intimacies that surprised her most. The way Daniel always poured her coffee first in the morning. How he'd started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table, not romantic gestures but simple kindnesses. The comfortable silence they shared during evening chores, both working efficiently in the same space without getting in each other's way. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but the emotional distance between them was gradually closing, not romance exactly, but genuine affection and respect. Clara found herself looking forward to their evening conversations after Emma was asleep, when they'd sit on the porch and discuss ranch business, local news, or plans for the future. "I've been thinking," Daniel said one such evening, "about expanding the house. Adding a proper parlor, maybe another bedroom or two. Planning for more children?" Clara asked, surprised by how the idea didn't frighten her. "Planning for possibilities," Daniel replied carefully. "This arrangement, it's working better than I expected." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. Better than I expected, too. The trouble came on a warm afternoon in early October, when Clara was hanging laundry while Emma played in the garden. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced visitors, and Clara felt the familiar chill of anxiety that had been her constant companion during those weeks on the road. Two men rode up to the house, well-dressed, city-soft with the kind of calculating eyes that meant trouble. Clara recognized the type immediately. Richard's associates. The men who collected debts and didn't much care how they got paid. "Afternoon, ma'am," the larger man said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "We're looking for a Mrs. Clara Hayes. We have some business with her late husband." "My name is Morrison now," Clara said carefully, positioning herself between the men and Emma. "And my husband is very much alive." Daniel appeared from the barn, alerted by voices and his own instincts about trouble. He moved with deceptive casualness, but Clara noticed how his hand rested near the pistol at his hip. "Gentlemen," Daniel said pleasantly, "something I can help you with?" The second man, thin and sharp-featured like a ferret, spoke up. "We're here about some debts owed by one Richard Hayes. This lady was his wife, which makes her responsible for what he owes." "Was his wife," Daniel corrected, his voice still pleasant but with an edge that made the horses sidestep nervously. "She's my wife now, and any debts from her previous life died with that marriage." "That's not how debt works, friend," the large man said, his tone less polite now. "Hayes owed our employer $5,000 plus interest. Money don't just disappear because a woman finds herself a new husband." Emma had stopped playing and was looking between the adults with the intuitive fear of a child who sensed danger. Clara moved closer to her daughter, fighting the urge to snatch her up and run. "How much did Hayes actually borrow?" Daniel asked calmly. $2,000, the ferret admitted. "But with interest and collection fees, it's grown considerably." Daniel's laugh was not a pleasant sound. "Collection fees. Is that what you call threatening women and children?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Clara could see Jim and Miguel moving closer from the corrals, drawn by the confrontation. The visitors noticed too, their eyes calculating odds and escape routes. "We're reasonable men," the large man said. We'll take 1,500 and call it even, cash. Daniel stepped forward, and something in his movement made both debt collectors take an involuntary step back. Clara had seen her husband work with difficult horses, gentle but absolutely unyielding. And now she saw the same quality applied to men who threatened his family. "Let me explain something to you, gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice quiet, but carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This is my land, my family, and my jurisdiction. The sheriff in town is a personal friend, and Judge Henderson, who handled my wife's adoption papers, takes a dim view of men who threaten women and children." Emma had moved to stand beside Clara, one small hand gripping her mother's skirt. The child's fear sparked something dangerous in Daniel's eyes. "Furthermore," he continued, "any legitimate debt died with Richard Hayes. What you're describing sounds more like extortion to me, and in Kansas territory we handle extortion with rope." Jim and Miguel had reached the house now, both men armed and clearly ready to follow Daniel's lead. The debt collectors were outnumbered and outgunned, but desperation made men dangerous. "Hayes took our money," the ferret said, his voice rising. "Someone's got to pay for it." "Hayes is dead," Clara said firmly, finding her courage. "I have nothing that belonged to him, no access to anything he might have hidden, no way to pay debts I never agreed to." "You're wasting your time here." "The woman's got a point," Jim said conversationally. "Seems to me you boys are barking up the wrong tree. Maybe you should look for Hayes's gambling partners, or the saloon girls he spent money on, or the business associates who might actually know where his assets went." The large man's face was red with frustration. "This ain't over, Morrison. Our employer don't give up easy." "Then your employer should come himself next time," Daniel replied. "I prefer dealing with principals rather than hired muscle. Makes negotiations cleaner. And bring the sheriff with him," Miguel added cheerfully. "We like things legal and proper around here." The debt collectors exchanged glances, clearly recognizing they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of defeat. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. Daniel immediately moved to her side, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Emma, sweetness, why don't you help Miguel feed the chickens?" he suggested quietly. The little girl looked between her parents, sensing undercurrents she couldn't understand, but trusting the adults to handle whatever needed handling. She took Miguel's offered hand and skipped away toward the chicken coop. "Will they come back?" Clara asked. That evening, after Emma was safely asleep, Clara and Daniel sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee grown cold while they talked through the implications of the day's confrontation. Daniel had sent Jim into town to speak with Sheriff Blake and Judge Henderson, ensuring the local authorities knew about the threats and would be watching for further trouble. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door," Clara said quietly. "I should have told you more about Richard's debts, about the men who might come looking. Would it have changed anything?" Daniel asked. "Would I have offered any less protection to you and Emma?" Clara considered this. "No, I don't think you would have." "Then there's nothing to apologize for. We're family now, Clara. We face troubles together." The word family still felt foreign to Clara, but also warm and solid in ways she was just beginning to understand. She'd spent so many months feeling alone, responsible for everything, carrying all the weight and all the fear by herself. The idea that someone else would share that burden, would stand between her and danger, was still miraculous to her. "They might come back with more men," she pointed out. "They might," Daniel agreed, "but they'll find us ready. Jim's already talked to the neighboring ranchers. Word's spreading about what happened today, and folks around here take a dim view of outsiders threatening women and children." Over the next few days, Clara began to understand what Daniel meant. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and offers of help. Sheriff Blake made a point of patrolling past the Double M more frequently. Even Pastor Williams came for coffee, though Clara suspected his visit had more to do with showing community support than spiritual guidance. "You've built something here," Clara observed, watching their third neighbor of the day drive away after dropping off fresh bread and promises to keep an eye out for strangers. "Not just a ranch, but a community." "Takes time," Daniel replied. "But people who choose to live out here, we depend on each other. An attack on one is an attack on all." That night, Clara found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the land that had become her refuge. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her small bed, one arm wrapped around her rag doll, the other flung out in the carefree abandon of a child who felt safe. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara, you all right?" She opened the door to find Daniel in the hallway, his hair mussed from sleep, concern evident in his eyes. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Just thinking about those men, about how different my life is now. 3 months ago, I was alone and scared, carrying Emma down dusty roads with nowhere to go. Now you're home," Daniel said simply. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Clara found herself settling into ranch life with surprising ease. She'd learned to manage the more complex aspects of running a household that served not just a family but a working ranch. Meals for harvest crews, medical care for minor injuries, bookkeeping for household expenses. All responsibilities she embraced with growing confidence. Emma had grown rosy-cheeked and sturdy, her vocabulary expanding daily, and her personality blooming in the security of consistent love. She called Daniel Papa now, though neither adult had prompted it, and he responded to the title with a tenderness that made Clara's heart contract with unexpected emotion. It was during one of their evening porch conversations that Clara realized her feelings for Daniel had evolved beyond gratitude and partnership into something deeper and more complex. "I've been thinking about expanding the cattle operation," Daniel was saying, his voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "Maybe adding some breeding stock from the Henderson Ranch. Quality animals that could improve our bloodlines." Clara listened to his plans with genuine interest, but found herself watching his profile in the lamplight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands moved expressively when he discussed something he cared about. When had she started seeing him not just as her rescuer and partner, but as an attractive man? "What do you think?" he asked, and Clara realized she'd been staring instead of listening. "I think you should follow your instincts," she said, hoping her voice sounded normal. "You've built something good here through careful planning and hard work." Daniel turned to look at her, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, a new awareness, a question forming behind his steady brown eyes. "Clara," he said quietly, "this arrangement of ours, it's working well." "Yes," she agreed, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Better than well, actually. I find myself looking forward to coming home in ways I never did before. Not just because there's good food and a clean house waiting, but because you're here, both of you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said quickly. "But I want you to know that if this partnership ever became something more, I'd welcome it, more than welcome it." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Clara found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the warmth in his voice and the hope in his eyes. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. Winter's first snow arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Emma build a lopsided snowman with Jim's help, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Behind her, Daniel moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing lunch with the easy domesticity they'd developed over the months. They worked together now without conscious thought. He would start the coffee while she checked on Emma. She would set the table while he carved the roast, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd rehearsed together for years. "She's going to catch cold out there," Clara murmured, watching Emma's mittened hands pack snow with intense concentration. "Jim won't let that happen," Daniel said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "He's more protective of her than a mother hen." Their shoulders brushed as they stood together, and Clara felt the familiar flutter of awareness that had been growing stronger each day. The conversation from the previous evening hung between them like a bridge they hadn't yet decided to cross. "Daniel," she said quietly, not moving away from his warmth, "about what we discussed, no pressure?" "Clara, I meant what I said. This partnership works exactly as it is, if that's what you prefer." She turned to face him, studying the honest concern in his expression. Here was a man who'd kept every promise he'd made, who'd protected her and Emma without asking for anything in return, who'd somehow transformed a desperate arrangement into something that felt like a real family. "What if I don't prefer it as it is?" she asked softly. Daniel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between that first handshake and now, this stopped feeling like an arrangement and started feeling like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Like something I chose rather than something I settled for." Daniel's hand came up to gently cup her cheek. Clara, I need you to be certain, because if we cross this line, there's no going back to business partners. I don't want to go back, Clara whispered. And then his lips were on hers, warm, gentle, full of promise rather than demand. When they broke apart, Clara felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her world. This wasn't the desperate passion of her youth with Richard, but something deeper and more sustainable, love built on respect, compatibility, and genuine affection. Emma's laughter drifted through the window, and they both turned to watch her attempt to put a hat on her crooked snowman. She needs to see us happy, Clara said suddenly. Really happy, not just content. Children learn about love from watching their parents. Then we'll show her what real love looks like, Daniel replied, wrapping his arms around Clara from behind. The kind that grows stronger through difficulties, that chooses commitment over convenience, that builds something lasting. Spring came early to Kansas that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and new beginnings that seemed to mirror the changes in the Morrison household. Clara had fully moved into Daniel's room after a winter of growing intimacy and deepening love, and Emma had adapted to the change with the resilience of childhood, simply accepting that Mama and Papa shared a room like other married couples. The ranch was thriving under their joint management. Clara had proven surprisingly adept at handling the business side of operations, her neat handwriting and careful attention to detail bringing order to Daniel's somewhat haphazard record-keeping. She'd also expanded the kitchen garden into a substantial operation that would provide vegetables for the ranch hands, as well as surplus to sell in town. But it was the personal changes that meant the most. Clara had never experienced the kind of steady, reliable love Daniel offered, not dramatic or overwhelming, but as constant and dependable as sunrise. He courted her still, bringing her wildflowers, listening to her dreams for the future, sharing his own hopes and fears, with the kind of vulnerability that spoke of complete trust. I want to build Emma a proper playhouse, he said one evening as they watched their daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, something with real windows and a little porch, maybe even a miniature stove. Clara smiled at the elaborate plans he was devising for their 2-year-old daughter. She'd love that, though I suspect you'd enjoy building it even more than she'd enjoy playing in it. Maybe, Daniel grinned, but she deserves something special. Something that's just hers. Emma had indeed become the light of Daniel's life, and Clara marveled at how naturally fatherhood had come to him. He was endlessly patient with her questions, gentle with her fears, and proud of every small accomplishment. Watching them together, Emma helping Daniel with ranch chores, or Daniel reading bedtime stories with voices for all the characters, Clara sometimes felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built together. Daniel, she said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, he'd installed as a wedding anniversary gift. I have something to tell you. Something in her tone made him set down his whittling and give her his full attention. What is it? Clara took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to need that extra bedroom you talked about building. For a moment, Daniel stared at her in incomprehension. Then understanding dawned and his face lit up with a joy so pure it took Clara's breath away. A baby? He whispered. Our baby, Clara confirmed, tears of happiness streaming down her face. The debt collectors returned on a warm day in late spring, but this time they found a very different situation awaiting them. Sheriff Blake was visiting for coffee when the familiar cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, and Daniel's call brought Jim, Miguel, and 2 neighboring ranchers who happened to be discussing cattle trades in the barn. Clara, now visibly pregnant and glowing with health, stood on the porch with Emma at her side while 7 armed men faced down the 2 city toughs who'd thought to find easy prey. Gentlemen, Sheriff Blake said pleasantly, I believe I told you last time that you weren't welcome in my jurisdiction. The large man who'd done most of the talking during their previous visit looked significantly less confident facing a sheriff's badge and superior numbers. We got rights. Hayes owed money and someone's got to pay. Actually, Judge Henderson said, emerging from the house where he'd been enjoying Clara's apple pie, I've been researching this matter extensively. Richard Hayes died intestate with no assets and considerable debts. Under territorial law, those debts died with him. His widow, now Mrs. Morrison, bears no legal responsibility for his gambling losses. Furthermore, the judge continued, clearly enjoying himself, Your continued harassment of Mrs. Morrison could be construed as attempted extortion, which carries a penalty of 10 years in territorial prison. Emma, who'd been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, suddenly broke free from Clara's restraining hand and marched down the porch steps toward the mounted strangers. "You're being mean to my mama," she announced with the fearless indignation of a 2-year-old. "Papa says mean men have to go away." Daniel scooped Emma up before she could get too close to the horses, but her words seemed to deflate the last of the debt collector's bravado. Here was a healthy, happy child clearly thriving in a loving home, protected by an entire community. Whatever claim they'd thought they had on Clara's past life had been thoroughly trumped by her present one. "This really is finished," the ferret-faced man said quietly to his partner. "Look at this place, these people. She's got nothing from her old life, and everything she has now is protected by law and community." The large man spat in the dust, his frustration evident. "Boss ain't gonna like this. Boss can file a complaint with territorial authorities if he thinks he has a legal claim," Sheriff Blake said cheerfully. "But I suspect he'd rather write off the loss than face questions about his collection methods." The debt collectors left without another word, and Clara knew with certainty they wouldn't be back. Richard's past had finally been laid to rest, buried beneath the life she'd built with Daniel and the family they'd created together. "Well," Judge Henderson said, returning to the porch, "I believe that calls for another slice of pie. Stress is terrible for the digestion, you know." 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Daniel gently rock their son, baby Thomas, born healthy and strong after an easy labor that had surprised everyone. Emma, now 3 and fierce in her devotion to her baby brother, sat nearby playing with the elaborate dollhouse Daniel had built during Clara's pregnancy. The room was filled with late afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows Clara had curtained, with fabric she'd sewn herself. The walls displayed Emma's increasingly sophisticated artwork, alongside pressed wildflowers from their property. A quilt Clara's new friends from the church sewing circle had made covered the baby's crib, each square representing a prayer for his health and happiness. "Is he sleeping?" Clara whispered, moving to stand behind Daniel's chair. "Finally," Daniel murmured, not breaking the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair, "though I think he's more interested in fighting sleep than surrendering to it." Clara smiled, running her fingers through Daniel's hair. Their son had inherited his father's stubborn streak along with his brown eyes, though he had Clara's delicate features and Emma's sunny disposition. "Mama," Emma said softly, not wanting to wake the baby, "when Tommy's bigger, can we teach him to ride horses like Papa taught me?" "When he's bigger," Clara agreed. "But first he has to learn to walk." Emma nodded solemnly, then returned to arranging tiny furniture in her dollhouse with the intense concentration she brought to everything. Clara looked around the room that epitomized everything their life had become: comfortable, secure, filled with love and the promise of future growth. Through the window she could see the expanded ranch buildings, the thriving vegetable garden, the cattle grazing contentedly in green pastures. Jim was training a new ranch hand near the corrals, while Miguel repaired fence with the easy competence of someone who took pride in his work. This was what Daniel had meant when he'd said the ranch needed a mother. Not just someone to cook and clean, but someone to transform a house into a home, a business into a legacy, a collection of individuals into a family. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The life you might have had if you'd kept walking that day?" Clara considered the question seriously, as she always did when Daniel asked something important. What life might she have built if she'd continued down that dusty road? What other chances might she have found? "I think about the woman I was," she said finally. "Walking down that road with Emma in my arms, no destination, no hope, no idea what tomorrow would bring." She was so afraid, so tired, so certain that she'd lost everything worth having. She leaned down to kiss the top of Daniel's head, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and sunshine and the honest smell of hard work. That woman couldn't have imagined this life. This home, this family, this feeling of belonging somewhere completely. Clara looked down at their son, peacefully sleeping in his father's arms. "I don't regret the road that brought me here, Daniel. Every step of it led me to you, to Emma's happiness, to Thomas, to this life we've built together." Daniel reached up to clasp her hand. "Your baby needed milk and my ranch needed a mother. But what we found was so much more than either of us expected. We found home, Clara said simply. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the grass, carrying the sense of growing things and the promise of seasons yet to come. Inside their house, their home, a family born of necessity had become a family bound by love, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things in life begin with the simple recognition of shared need and the courage to build something lasting from it. Emma looked up from her dollhouse and smiled at her parents, content in the knowledge that she was safe, loved, and home. Baby Thomas slept peacefully in his father's arms, unaware of the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. And Clara Morrison, no longer Clara Hayes, no longer a woman with nowhere to go, stood surrounded by everything she'd never dared to dream she could have. A husband who loved her, children who filled her heart, and a home that would shelter them all through whatever seasons lay ahead.